It's pretty certain that there are Baha'i communities spread throughout the Pacific Islands. There's a great diversity in receptivity, so that we have very large communities in Papua New Guinea, Kiribati and other places. And certainly the Baha'i teachings are well known in the Pacific. Everybody from Tonga will know of the Baha'i Faith, or from Vanuatu everybody's heard about the Baha'i Faith, so it's understood to that extent. There are smaller communities and there are larger communities, but we could say that through the North Pacific, the Western Pacific, the Eastern Pacific, that the Baha'i Faith has become established. In every community in the Pacific, there will be a local Baha'i community and centre, and certainly in all of the major cities and towns in the Pacific, these centres are known. I'm thinking, for example, even in Honiara, that the Baha'i Centre is the name of a bus stop. But I think also significant to think of the Baha'i House of Worship in Samoa that was built in the 1980s in honour of the fact that the head of the state, Malietoa Tanamo Fili II, was a Baha'i from 1968. He passed away recently, just several years ago.
My sincere and warmest expression of thanks goes to the members of the Baha'i Faith.
But he was one of the champions of the Baha'i teachings in the Pacific, and now there's a magnificent temple outside of Apia, partly in recognition of that fact. That's the mother temple of the Pacific Islands. Baha'is meet either in their homes, in their villages, or in centres, and those who visit the towns of the Pacific will often know where the Baha'i Centre is. The New Zealand Baha'i community is reaching its 100th year, so that in 2012 there'll be a centenary celebration. And as part of that centenary, it's a chance to reflect on the growth of the Baha'i communities, not only in New Zealand but around the Pacific in the past 100 years. But in order to celebrate that, you need to know what the past contains. Who were the champions of the Baha'i teachings? Where did they live? What their occupations were? What was their family circumstance? An early Solomon Islander from the Western Solomons, his name was Bill Gina. And he had never heard before of Europeans who would welcome people into their house, because at that time there was such a segregation. Even though it's the Solomons' country, they're the people of the Solomon Islands, and yet people who were working in the British regime there, the colonial administration, didn't have them in the house. So he went up to the house of Alvin and Gertrude Blum and he knocked on the door to test whether it was true that they would welcome him in. And they welcomed him in. And we know that the Pacific Islands have very strong cultural traditions that held communities together, formed the basis of their system of meaning and of values and of purpose in life, based on traditions, ritual, art, performance. And that there was a tendency during the period of missionarization for those cultures to be eroded, sometimes in a heavy-handed fashion, sometimes in more subtle. But it's interesting to see the way in which the Baha'i communities in the Pacific will make their own decisions about what is in conformity with Baha'i teachings and what is not. That might be, for example, in art forms, in how to respect the dead, in how to observe marriage, in how to raise children, all of these ways in which culture plays a big role, in how to treat strangers, and how to people who are passing by your village, how to handle that, handle warfare and conflict resolution. In the Baha'i community, the young people have a voice. Their training is taken seriously for children and youth. The recognition that they are the future leaders of society. The significance not only of, let's say, moral education because they're in the Baha'i community, but also the other forms of education, that they get a trade of some sort or a profession, I think is a feature of the Baha'i community, so the emphasis on education. I think also because of the Baha'i teaching of equality of men and women has been a challenge in many parts of the Pacific, where the status of women was in some places lower than that of men. And on becoming Baha'is, they have had to confront this teaching that says that men and women play an equal role in society and in the family and in public life, and have to find ways forward with that. And it's a great pleasure to go into Pacific Baha'i communities and see women playing a very strong role that they may not have been able to play within their own village traditionally, but now having become members of the Baha'i community, women are taking on very significant roles, administrative roles, leadership roles.
Any lasting impressions or stories that you want to share with us before we finish off?
I do want to share one memory that I have from 1992 when I was in New York at a large Baha'i conference that was held that year. But it relates to the Pacific. We had lived through 1991 in Papua New Guinea. And so in 1992, we had many friends from Papua New Guinea who were at that conference. And I passed one of my Baha'i friends on the street, and I know him to be a village man. And I said, "Are you nervous in this big city? How is it for you?" And he said, "No, I'm not nervous." He said, "This is my city, and here I have a village man coming for the first time out of his country in the heart of New York and not feeling overawed, feeling quite at home." And I pondered that quite a bit, and I think that I tried to learn from him, from that anecdote.